Railway Works opened in January 1843 as a repair and maintenance facility for the new Great Western Railway. By 1900, the works had expanded dramatically and employed over 12,000 people. At its peak in the 1930s, the works covered over 300 acres and was capable of producing 3 locomotives a week. At its peak in the mid-20th century, 14,000 people were employed at the works, and the Great Western Railway transformed Swindon. Following its heyday, it was to serve as the principal West England maintenance centre until its closure in 1986. Hi, I'm John, and welcome to John's Box, and welcome to a new series of God's Wonderful Railway at Swindon. This is part 1. And this whole series of episodes deals with Swindon and its railways. So we're going to look at the history of the railway works in Swindon, the GWR line, and Swindon stations, and some of the locomotives, and also the railway village in the series of, I guess, about 6 episodes which will be running over the next 9 months, I guess, maybe longer. I've already looked at Swindon's bus and plane history, but the railway history speaks for itself, especially, if you're from Swindon, that the railways made the town. They took Swindon from being a village back in the early 19th century to an industrial town by the end of the First World War even. So part 1 looks at that first phase, the birth of the railways, and finishes at the Second World War. So here goes. I hope you enjoy the videos, the photos, and the commentary that runs alongside it. The railways made a huge impact on the life of Britain in the first half of the 19th century, but nowhere did it have an impact as great as it did on the town of Swindon. Before the Great Western Railway completed its first section of railway from Paddington to Maidenhead Riverside in June 1838, the sleepy town of Swindon did have a weekly market and even an annual mop fair, but its population was still less than 2,500. It had been therefore a small agricultural holding before the arrival of Victorian engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel and his railway. In 1835, Parliament approved the construction of the Great Western Main Line between London and Bristol by the Great Western Railway. Its chief engineer was Isambard Kingdom Brunel. From 1836, Brunel had been buying locomotives from various makers for the new railway. Brunel's general specifications gave the locomotive makers a free hand in design, although subject to certain constraints such as piston speed and axle load, resulting in a diverse range of locomotives of mixed quality. In 1837, Brunel recruited Daniel Gooch and gave him the job of rectifying the heavy repair burden of the GWR's mixed bag of purchased locomotives. It became clear that the GWR needed a central repair work, so in 1840 Gooch identified a site at Swindon because it was at the junction of the Golden Valley Line and also a convenient division of the Great Western Line for engine working. With Brunel's support, Gooch made his proposal to the GWR directors, who, on 25th of February 1841, authorised the establishment of the works at Swindon. Construction started immediately and they became operational on the 2nd of January 1843. There are several stories relating to how the railway came to pass through Swindon. A well-circulated myth that Brunel and Gooch were surveying a vale north of Swindon, and that Brunel either threw a stone or dropped a sandwich and declared that spot to be the centre of the works. However, Swindon's midway point between GWR terminals and the topography of land near the town were more likely factors. The GWR main line was originally planned to cut through Savernake Forest near Marlborough, but the Marquis of Aylesbury, who owned the land, objected. With the railway needing to run near to a canal at this point, Swindon was a logical choice for the works. It was 20 miles north of the original route. The line was laid in 1840, but the location of the works was still undecided. Tracks were laid at Didcot in 1839. Gooch noted that the nearby Wilton Berks Canal gave Swindon a direct connection with the Somerset coalfield. He also realised that engines needed to be changed at Swindon, or close by, as the gradients from Swindon to Bristol were much more arduous than the relatively easy gradients between London and Swindon. Drawing water for the engines from the canals was also considered, and an agreement to this effect was completed in 1843. Once the plan was set for the railways to come to Swindon, it was first intended to bring it closely along the foot of Swindon Hill, so as to be as close as possible to the town without entailing the excessive engineering works of building on the hill. However, the Goddard family, lord of the manor of Swindon, following the example of the Marquis of Aylesbury and many other landowners of the day, objected to having it near their property, so it was laid a couple of miles further north. If you've managed to get this far into the video, well done, thumbs up to you. Well, statistics show that probably you're not one of my subscribers. Thank you if you are, of course. I am grateful for every one subscriber that I have. In order to get a notification of future videos that I make, and they do come out at least twice a week, subscribe and press on the bell to get notifications. And I want my channel to grow, but without your support that won't happen. So thank you very much once again, and enjoy the rest of this video. Cheers. With many of the early structures built and adorned by stone extracted from the construction of Box Tunnel, the first building, the locomotive repair shed, was completed in 1841 using contract labour, with the necessary machinery installed within it by 1842. Initially only employing 200 men, repairs began in 1843 with the first new locomotive, the Premier, built in 1846 in under 2 weeks and renamed Great Western. This was followed by 6 more, with the Iron Dukes, including the Lord of the Isles, considered the fastest broad-gauge engine of its day. By 1851 the works were employing over 2,000 men and were producing about 1 locomotive a week, with the first standard-gauge engine built in 1855. A rolling mill for manufacturing rails was installed in 1861, attracting workers from South Wales. Indeed, most of the work was concentrated at Swindon. Like most early railways, the GWR was built with gentle gradients and a minimum of curves, which meant that it was able to operate fast, lightweight single-wheelers 222 and 422. However, from 1849, Gooch also built 440 saddle tanks for the hillier routes in Devon. In 1867, Swindon was made a central workshop for the construction of carriages and wagons. In 1864, when Joseph Armstrong had taken over, he took on the responsibility of improving the passenger stock, resulting in 1878 of a separate carriage and wagon works being built on land north of the station. The first Royal Saloon was built in 1874 and converted to standard gauge in 1899. 1875 saw the opening of the boiler and tender making shops, eventually used to also produce parts for locomotives and marine engines for the GWR's fleet of ships and barges. The first GWR through corridor train was built in 1891, with electric lighting introduced in 1900. In 1892, the GWR completed the process of converting their lines to standard gauge. 13 miles of the new broad gauge sidings were laid to accommodate the influx of rolling stock, so that by the 22nd of May 1892, 195 locomotives, 748 carriages, and 3,500 wagons and vans were stored for conversion to the new gauge. Those that could not be converted were scrapped on site. By the turn of the century, the works were employing an estimated 3/4 of Swindon's entire workforce. George Churchwood's tenure, first as Assistant Chief Superintendent in 1897, then Locomotive Superintendent in 1902, produced heavier locomotives, the 440 City class, then the County class. Later in 1906, North Star was rebuilt as the first four-cylinder 460. In 1908, the first Pacific 462, the only one of its type in the country for many years, was built. From 1914, the works turned to aiding the war effort, producing 12 howitzers by the end of the year. Charles Collett, Chief Mechanical Engineer from 1921 to 1941, greatly improved the works' boiler making and its facilities for working heavy gauge sheet metal. In 1927, the GWR's most powerful and largest locomotive, the King class, was introduced to become the flagship of the GWR fleet. The Kings had been developed from the class Castle, which, along with the halls, were the foundation of the GWR's reputation and image. This was the heyday of Swindon Works, when 14,000 people were employed, and the main locomotive fabrication workshop, the A-shop, was, at 11.25 acres, one of the largest covered areas in the world. During World War II, Swindon was once again involved with military hardware, producing various types of guns mountings. Loco wheel-turning lathes were also ideally suited for making turret rings for tanks. The works also built landing craft and parts for midget submarines. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'll be back again in a few weeks' time with part 2. That's the post-war era up until the railways closures. Don't forget to do all the YouTube stuff, to like, comment, and of course to subscribe to my channel. So thanks again, and see you next time. Bye.